So good afternoon, everyone. Today I would like to discuss a little bit how humanitarian organizations respond to violence in urban settings. And this presentation is drawing from my experience and research in Latin America. I recently came back from a trip from Colombia, Mexico, Honduras, and El Salvador, so it made me reflect a lot on the questions that are up for discussion today. So I'll start with some maps, because I think these are a good tool to show what's happening in this context. This is a map of Tegucigalpa, the capital city of Honduras. And here you can see in the different colors which gangs of maras control different neighborhoods in the city. So the city is really fragmented and sectoralized based on the control of different armed actors. The same things happen in El Salvador. You can see different colors. So here you have even more groups. So the blue color is a group called the Mau Mau. Then the orange color is the Mara Salvatrucha. The green color is the 18 Revolucionarios. And the red color is the 18 Sureños, so the split from the Barrio 18 into two different groups recently. This is Tumaco in Colombia. This is a city on the Pacific coast. So the upper part is what you see on Google Maps. You can see that the city is actually two islands and a peninsula in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the lower part of the picture is which groups control which part of the city. This is not updated, but just to give an idea of what's happening there. So what I actually wanted to show with these maps is the territorial division and the fragmentation of spaces within the city, which are under the control of different armed groups, which fight against each other. They control parts of the city and the population which lives into certain sectors of the city. I was in El Salvador in a community called Tineti, which is probably as big as this university campus. The people cannot get in or out because they belong to a gang, which is not the same gang which is controlling the territories around this community. So they have a beautiful market 5 meters from the entrance. There's really a gate to the entrance to the community, and they can't go to the market because they would be killed, because the people think that if a gang is controlling your community, you're also, as a person living there, you're supporting that gang. So people are made enemies between each other, even if it's not true. Maybe they're not supporting any gang, but the fact, by association, the fact of living in a certain territory means, or for other people, means that they're supporting a specific group. In Tumaco, if you cross, there's a bridge between these two islands. It's called the Puente El Pindo. So there's one group controlling the island in the middle, and the other group controlling the island, which actually gives you access to the rest of the country, because there's only one road getting out of Tumaco. But they're controlled by two different groups, and the group which controls that part of the city controls the whole traffic of drugs to Central and Northern America, because it's the Pacific route to Mexico, practically. So, and crossing that bridge is really sometimes a matter of life or death, so much so that the government has sent an army to control and to check on that bridge, because people that are living and they want to leave the island, they want to go to the land, to the rest of the country, oftentimes are killed just by getting out of there. So this is what's happening in many of these countries. The space fragmentation and the territorial control. So when you were asking me what is the, what do spaces do? How can you research conflict and health approaching by the angle of spatial violence? I thought maybe what we can get out of this situation is really you have different spaces within the same city. Territorial control. So you have different groups controlling different neighborhoods. And it's territorial control, but also social control, which also means that populations are confined within a very restricted space. they cannot get in or out of that space. But so also the gangs and the armed groups themselves, they have a self-imposed confinement, because they know that if they cross certain streets or certain boundaries from their community, they will get killed because the enemy is waiting for them outside. You have a system of sectors. So, for example, El Salvador is a country, not only the city, the capital city, but the entire country is divided sectorally based on which gangs is controlling which territory. And then you have a system of actually fragmented sovereignty. You have different control systems. You have a parallel capacity of this group of imposing a system of governance, system of justice, and you have, on the other hand, the withdrawal of the state, of the government, which is unable to provide security to these populations, unable to provide basic services, and so its own legitimacy in many of these countries is also questioned, the legitimacy of the government. And yet what you have from all this is this invisible barriers. So people know that if they cross a specific street or if they cross a specific bridge, they're putting their life at risk, they'll be considered enemies. So there's also, what are the consequences? If you need to go to school, the school is maybe 2 blocks away, but it's in a neighborhood controlled by a different group. You're not going to school. If you need to go to the hospital or to the clinic, same story. You cannot go to the clinic, maybe the nearest to your house, because it's controlled by a different group. It's 3 streets away. So perhaps you need to take a bus and go to the other side of the city where there's another neighborhood controlled by the same gang that is controlling yours, but you have access to. So here comes also another question, which is how can humanitarians enter into these neighborhoods and sustain their presence there? So this has been a topic in my research lately, but it's also another question on how, who do you deal with when you want to establish your presence in specific neighborhoods when the government is not able or incapable of providing you security and the government is not there. So I just wanted to show a little bit what violence does in the city. So we said that we have in urban areas, they are often, smuggling corridors and groups fight against each other for social and territorial control. So you would probably call this spatial violence in a way. And this is everything that's happening in these places when the groups fight against each other, or they fight against the population, or they want to punish the population, or they use the population as a, the population get caught in the middle. So of course you have many issues like murder, extreme physical violence, torture, enforced disappearances, threats to life, gender-based violence, forced recruitment of especially young people into these armed groups, into the gangs, kidnappings, etc. But you also have, again, and I think this is the important point, extreme limitations of movement, limitation of humanitarian access, which has, of course, consequences on the health situation of these people. So this I took from The Economist a couple of weeks ago. So all the countries that I mentioned are the world's most murderous metropolis. This is what violence does into these cities. This is, unfortunately, a situation in Latin America no one talks about because it's not an open, formal conflict. It's not an armed conflict, neither an international armed conflict nor an internal armed conflict, and it's just supposed to be just violence. But of course, if you look at the homicide rates, they're staggering, and here you have also the list of what are those 30 most dangerous, more homicide rates of the 30s, highest 30s in the world. So what does this make in terms of humanitarian consequences? We discussed the lack of access to healthcare and basic services. There are, I think in El Salvador, between 1/3 and 1.5 of the population doesn't have access to basic health services because either they have limitations of movement or the clinics and the public structures are closed because of violence and threats, and particularly threats to the health personnel. So certain doctors and nurses, they don't want to go and work somewhere else in the city where they consider it's too dangerous for them, so they'd rather leave their job and then go into a specific place in a specific clinic. And then you also have, of course, the fact that gangs, they control the movements, everyone movement. You want to get in and out, they need to know who you are, what's your face. They took my picture to know who I was, where I was going, who I was going to talk to, and so on. So it's really a system of control which is very thorough. They know everyone in the neighborhood. And I think another issue that really, I never thought about it, but the ambulance services, they don't work anymore. Because let alone during the day, but when it's getting dark, you have volunteers from the Red Cross or the Green Cross, they also have there, or other organizations. People have IDs where their own neighborhood is written, where they live, the resident, not just the city, but really the address. And they have to carry them all the time. And when they when they need to go from a volunteer from an ambulance service, they need to go and pick up someone, we just call them. The gangs will check where these volunteers live, where they come from, and which gang is controlling the part of the city where they live. So certain people cannot get into certain neighborhoods. And imagine having to go at night. You receive a call. There's a pregnant woman who needs to deliver, or an injured person, or a heart attack, and the people don't get the ambulance cannot go into certain neighborhoods. Or there is a system, a protocol in place where the family members of the sick person, they have to go and tell the gang leader of the neighborhood that an ambulance is coming, and someone has to wait for the ambulance at the entrance of the community so that the ambulance can enter, but the ambulance can only follow a specific road, and then they have to pick up the patient and go back. But it doesn't work. So it means in El Salvador, it only works in 3-4 communities where the ambulance can do this. They have this system, but otherwise it's really not working. And also the fact that the public health system is not functioning in certain places, and you have the suspension of programs, prevention programs, health promotion, anything that has to do with health personnel getting into certain neighborhoods and work with the community. It's no longer working. There are other humanitarian consequences which are not necessarily related to health, which is, as I mentioned before, the lack of access to education. So people that cannot go to certain schools because they're in the wrong neighborhood. Of course, lack of access to legal protection. This means that in situations like that, the governments responded with these mano dura policies where actually they put more army into the street. They have shoot to kill orders. So there's even more abuses and violation from the side of the government forces towards the population. There's a big impunity. If you look at Mexico, or there's no crime that goes. And above all, also this lack of trust that produces the destruction of social fabric and cohesion within the communities. So we said, if we look back at health consequences, we see that you have, of course, death, injuries, wounded, trauma. Sexual violence is really an epidemic in this kind of setting. But I would also like to stress the mental health consequences. So these are populations who live really under constant threat. And their family members have been kidnapped, tortured, they disappear, they don't know where they are. And this it's all producing, of course, mental health consequences, which are often also unaddressed by the public health system. So this is a niche which is really important for humanitarians to address. And then mental health consequences can be, of course, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, but also anxiety, substance abuse, suicide, etc. So this is just a short list of potential health consequences. And then what is the humanitarian response in these settings? The humanitarians, there are some humanitarian organizations which are working responding to violence in these settings, and they came up with this OSV, which is other situations of violence. So all the violence that doesn't fall under the international humanitarian laws, so conflict violence, but all other forms of violence. So they have new roadmaps and new frameworks to try to address the problem and give a rationale to their presence and intervention in these countries, and have a roadmap. So in terms of health, it's really to provide access to health and services for certain collectives of victims, or to provide access to health services where access is not there or is limited. Respond to mental health needs, and of course assist direct victims of violence and sexual violence. So this is, if you find, most humanitarian organizations that are working in Latin America at the moment, they are working under this OSD framework, which is this is the health component of the framework, and then you also have a protection component, which I will skip for time. So what are the takeaways, I think, from this situation? So given that there are really large areas of countries and of cities that are effectively under the control of armed groups and not of the government, but they have also unmet humanitarian needs. I'm really advocating for more humanitarian organizations to, go and respond into this area and deliver essential life-saving humanitarian aid, particularly in the health sector. And then also, I think for me, it's not about one humanitarian space that the humanitarian organizations are negotiating, but there are really several small localized spaces, and the fragmentation of these spaces and the violence that is happening. So the violence has an impact on people's health and well-being, and this fragmentation is also one component, one determinant of the health and well-being of populations. So.
Excellent. Thank you very much.